So welcome back. As I said in my previous video, this is going to be a two-part series talking about watercolor and gouache while showing y'all how to do the different techniques and how to produce art pieces that to your liking and your style and how to just create masterpieces, honestly. No, I'm just kidding about the masterpieces, but I'm going to show you all a tutorial on how to do both watercolor and gouache, and this video would be focusing on the gouache aspect. If you want to watch the watercolor series, you can see my previous video. So as you know, we start off with our basic sketch on the page very lightly so that we have an indication of where we're going to place the paint. And just like watercolor paintings, I would start off with a base of the lightest color that would be in that area, and I would just fill that area with that color. You could actually use gouache on watercolor paper as well. This is the same page I am using to paint my gouache on that I did the previous watercolor on, because you're using water, not as much water as watercolor, but you are still using water to dilute the paint in order to spread it onto the page. Everyone uses gouache a bit differently because gouache is so versatile that it's not as watered down as watercolor, but it isn't as thick as acrylic. It's more in between. It's more of like an opaque watercolor. So in saying that, you can do different layers on gouache and you can put light on top of dark, but the contrast of the lighter painting on top of the dark areas won't be as bright as you would get as if you put the light on white background. So even though you can put light on dark, I would suggest that throughout the painting you try to focus in on the light areas where possible. Like, try to keep the light areas light. If you know you're going to paint an area in a light color such as yellow, don't paint red underneath it or black underneath first as a base layer and then put yellow. Although you may see the yellow, if you do that you won't see it as intense as if you just put the yellow straight away on top of the white. So in saying that, you can definitely put light on top of dark. I try my best to keep the light areas light and put the dark areas dark where possible, even though afterwards you can put light on top of some of the darker areas. But when I'm painting gouache, I normally paint it as a kind of a vectorized image, meaning I put layer on top of layer, but I try not to blend as much as possible, where some areas obviously you would want to blend, but in this gouache piece you would realize that I'm not blending as much as I did in the watercolor one. In this one I'm doing different layers upon layer, but I'm trying my best not to blend but have it as more of a vectorized image, as if you know you're working in Illustrator or Photoshop and you do one color base and then you get a different color, maybe similar shade or tone, but it's a different color, and you put it on top of that and you don't blend it, and then you take a different color then and you put it on top of that. So let's say for this one I would take the yellow as my base color, and then I would get a darker yellow, kind of orangey tone, and I put it on top of the yellow, and then I would get a even darker orange and put it on top of that, So we're going from light to dark, but it's coming on top of each other, and then I'll get a kind of browny orangey tone, and then I'll put it on top of that, and maybe then I would start to blend the darkest area with the second darkest area to give it a bit of effect. But overall, I try to keep it as a vectorized painting. Like I said before, using gouache, you don't have to use as much water as watercolor paint, but you do have to use water in order to dilute the gouache paint in order to spread it onto your page. So how much water do you use? Basically, the lighter and more flowing color that you want, you add more water. More water equals more spreadability equals lighter color, basically. And if you want a more thickened, really thick opaque color from whatever gouache color you are using, then you want to add less water. So by saying that, I would start off by adding a little bit of water at a time, and you have to really get accustomed to it. So probably get like a separate page and use different mixtures of water to paint ratios and see what you want until you get accustomed to how it goes. Because the color, where I said in watercolor, the color dries 2 shades lighter than what you put it on. In gouache, it's not necessarily the same thing, but it does dry a bit lighter, but it still retains that intensity and that color that you actually put onto the page. And whereas here in dark areas, remember in watercolor I also said in dark areas you don't just want to use fully black, but you'd want to mix it in with a bit of color like some purples or blues and reds to give it a bit of effect to, you know, the shadows would be complementing the surroundings. In gouache, on the other hand, you could still do that, but since I'm using a kind of a vectorized approach, I do have a really intense black, so I would mix my black with a bit of purple or a bit of orange according to what it is I'm painting and the surroundings, but the color I mix in won't be as intense, and you won't see it as much as how I do it in my watercolor or acrylics. So in gouache, the dark areas where I paint in black would be quite dark, so it gives that effect of the whole light to darks and the vectorizing. That's just the way I do it. You don't have to do it like that. That is just how I like to do it. I like to show that intensity, and I like to give that contrast between the lights and darks and give that effect of color, and it very much portrays in this piece especially. looking at the pieces side by side, you can very much tell that there is a complete difference between watercolor and gouache. Could be good, could be bad. In watercolor, there's a much more flowing effect, and you could really use water to dilute those colors and make it flow and give you that vibrant effect. Whereas in gouache, it's a bit more opaque, but not as opaque as acrylic to make it as realistic. But at the same time, I use a vector form, but the vector form, how I use it, gives it a bit of realism and depth into the painting, and that is really what I was going for here. And yeah, I do hope this helps you in deciding if to use watercolor or gouache for your piece according to what you want to achieve and how you want to work the medium. Thank you again for watching this video. This was the second part of the two-part series on watercolor versus gouache. And if you want to see how I use my watercolors and tips and techniques on how to use watercolor, you can watch my previous video from last week. And if you like this video on gouache, and if it has helped you or has inspired you to try this new medium, because I know a lot of artists don't really use this, drop your comments below, give a thumbs up, tell me what your thoughts are, and yeah, show me your pieces from both watercolor or gouache, or both, or if it's something completely different. But yeah, thank you.